welcome everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started in just a second. So let everybody get their seats and any more lingering out there. And thank you all for finding the room. That's great. And I know some of you might be a little soggy and wet and damp, and hopefully you had a great march if you marched or saw presentations that you really enjoyed. So this is all great stuff going on here today. So I'm Elaine Leslie, and I'm the Division Chief of Biological Resources for the National Park Service, actually stationed in Fort Collins, Colorado, where all of our national park scientists are based. We just have a small skeletal staff here in Washington, D.C., and they're very happy about that right now. So a global conservation strategy. Let's think about that today. This would be a strategy that uses best available science and builds from the core of protected areas to ensure that we act upon conservation of our natural and our cultural heritage today and well into the future. What is needed now is not just a cohesive and comprehensive approach for a cornerstone strategy, but proof of concept projects implemented on the ground that embrace and exhibit concepts of connectivity and landscape level principles. That's what we're going to be witness to here today from our presenters. To protect our planet, it requires expanding beyond our human-constructed boundaries and reaching out far and wide to partners new and well-established, and embrace new technologies and strategies in a more unified approach to continental conservation. What we will hear about today includes new and innovative conservation approaches that must be replicated in other areas. These projects are emblems of the need to protect and sustain entire landscapes that are vital to not only natural and cultural resource conservation, but to the vitality of communities, their economies, and our world's quality of life. There are thousands of friends outside today, not out in the rain because we feel dismal about the future, but because we are hopeful. We are dedicated, and we will make a difference. Our collaborative conservation partnerships and success stories must not be the rare exceptions, but the standard as we restore and protect our natural and cultural resources, our heritage, and the values across our planet. So today we have some experts here that we just can't wait to hear about their wonderful success stories. Certainly there are challenges, but today is about optimism. So we're going to jumpstart this session with, let me get my order right, Gregory Miller, President and CEO of NatureServe. And Greg is no newcomer to conservation. He has more than 30 years of experience in biodiversity conservation, sustainable recreation, and natural resource program and policy development. Greg has worked tirelessly in many sectors, including serving in a career as Vice President of the Nature Conservancy, where for more than 15 years he developed the Conservancy's conservation strategy and biodiversity project portfolio for South America, as well as co-managing Latin America and Caribbean Parks in Peril program. Greg's also lived and worked as a naturalist in the Galapagos Islands and the Andes for many years, and has held a lifetime commitment to environmental stewardship. As a long-standing volunteer leader for the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts of America, Gregory has committed his life to making the planet a better place for future generations. Welcome, Gregory.
I didn't know that Boy Scout and Girl Scout stuff was in there. But when we're talking about the stewards of tomorrow, that is certainly one avenue to utilize. Well, thank you, everyone. I really appreciate your attention and interest, and overall, thank you for all the work that you're doing on behalf of nature. It's very important for us all. Do I just use the...
Yeah.
Oh, very good. Okay, got it. As noted, I'm going to talk about today and share with you two examples of what we at NatureServe and our partners have been doing at the really the continental scale. One in North America, the other in the tropical Andes, actually, where my research interests have been for a number of years there. And just want to share with you, if I can, a couple of key elements so that you can put in context. Some of you may know NatureServe, others perhaps not, but we originally were created about 40 years ago with the Nature Conservancy, and today we have over 80 programs across the hemisphere, and we really serve as the umbrella for a network, of a dynamic network of knowledge leaders and data managers. You can see that across the network we have over 1,000 scientists and data managers working, and that we're looking at well over 70,000 species and mapping 1,500 to 1,600 ecosystems across the planet. So data management and the provision of knowledge, and something you'll hear me say several times, decision quality data is really important for us in terms of moving forward. So just to put that in context, I'm also relatively new at NatureServe. I'm the president and CEO for about 5 months. But I was, as Elaine mentioned, TNC, and I served 12 years as the president of the American Hiking Society, bridging the recreation and conservation interface. So it's really been fun for me to come back home. So let me talk about 2 examples. First one are the North American temperate grasslands. You see here, let me go back. This is the current major temperate grasslands, 14 types that you see in terms of the historic extent. Excuse me. But then when we look at the coverage today, it's obviously far less. Now, when we talk about taking to scale and how do we share across from the Canadian north to the northern part of Mexico, how do we bring together and determine how we can actually achieve conservation at scale across one of the most threatened areas, actually in the Americas? Not surprisingly, I think most of you know that this is also one of the important breadbaskets of North America. Cultivation, particularly in the eastern part, with heavy mechanized agriculture, which is, of course, very disruptive. A bit more to the west, threats are a bit more on the grazing, but also agricultural side. But when you again think back of what the coverage we had, the coverage we have now, and then this is an IUCN map of protected areas of categories 1 to 4, maybe a little hard to see, but what I want to focus your attention on is the following. This is a highly threatened set of systems, these 14 grassland types, and if you look at the bottom, which I've circled in red, we have within all protected area types 1.2% of North America's temperate grasslands in any kind of protected area, at least by the IUCN categories. And when we look at our Aichi 2020 targets of looking for 17% of terrestrial and inland water systems to be protected within some measure of sustainable and effective protected area management, we are nowhere close to achieving that. But what we have done, and what I want to just show you now briefly, is that as part of the North American Wilderness and Protected Areas Committee, working with our colleagues also with the Fish and Wildlife Service, what we did is we brought together all of our efforts in Canada, in the US, and in Mexico. And then what we did is we took a look at, again, let me just go back so you can care, because these are time sequence. This is the historic extent, but then we ran through a series of criteria and looked at that current coverage, and then came up with what we have rolled out late in 2016, what is mapped here of those 14 grassland types by using systematic methodology, very decision-ready data, and bringing together the experts that are working in the temperate grasslands from Canada to US to Mexico. These are the areas that we believe, whether from conservation or restoration, that we believe would be the best bet for protecting the temperate grasslands of the United States. Now, what I showed you before is we had little over 1% in any protected status. What I want you to look at now is that map I just showed you. If we were to both include in protected areas and/or under restoration, what we would see, and this is where I want to be an optimist, if we put our shoulder to the wheel and we collectively as a conservation community do what is, and business and agencies and communities across the board, you can see then, and I don't have time to go through this, but you can see that we calculate in this that if we were to put under some form of protection or restoration moving forward, we could actually get close to that Aichi target. and would in fact have 15% of high representation. Decision quality data is driving this, and we see this as one way to protect one of the most threatened and endangered systems that we have, well, anywhere in the world, the grasslands across the planet. So be thinking about that, because we've been talking about at the summit here the importance of collecting information at all points, but unless you speak common language and maintain a methodology and are able to communicate one to another and establish a set of shared goals, it's very difficult to come to a more optimistic future. And what has been done here with the North American Wilderness and Protected Area Committee that we work on, which has all the federal agencies represented as well, but we were doing this particular analysis with the committee, we see opportunity here. There's hope. And we hope then, of course, it will direct the kind of investments that we want to see in time, money, sweat equity, and the future of research and conservation priorities. I see a lot of young faces in here, and I do have to say, my hat is off to the Smithsonian and to the organizers for doing the deep reach. You've exceeded certainly my expectations of seeing younger professionals coming into play, because you are truly the future in this. And this could be a very profitable, hopefully, both professionally and from just your future in their life. Second one is an area that's near and dear to me, where I've spent all my time as a research biologist. I'm a tropical plant ecologist by training in high Andes and in the Galapagos, as was mentioned. A second project that we worked on, which I wanted to share in terms of looking at big science at big scales and seeing, is the tropical Andes biodiversity hotspot. Now, it's one of 35 hotspots that we're at, whether you believe in the hotspot concept or not, in terms of looking at that kind of organization. It's the second largest in geographic scope. It is the #1 in terms of biodiversity by a significant margin, frankly. You've got a number of mega diverse countries in there, including the #1 country, I would say, Colombia. 7 countries across, tremendous challenges, tremendous biodiversity, quite a bit of poverty, obviously, as well. And so the Critical Ecosystem Partnership Fund, which Conservation International manages with a number of very important high-level investors. We've heard from some here at the, and donors here at the summit. Very important. But what we wanted to do, and their task to us, was how can we look at their future investments? They were going to make a new investment. This was in 2015. A new investment of another $10 million. They wanted to say, well, where would be the best places for us, given the current and the projected landscape that we have? And when you talk about an extraordinary diversity of habitats, challenges, threats, including narcotics, violence, unsustainable agriculture, you name it, that Tropical Andes has it. What we took to task, and it was a team from NatureServe and a group out of Ecuador called Ecodecisión, we put together a team from each of these countries, worked together to identify the, using key biodiversity areas as the unit. We ended up coming up, and this is a very big number, 442 terrestrial key biodiversity areas and 29 corridors identified. Now that is a huge portfolio to look at. You can see them. I'm not going to list them off, but I hope you can read them if you have a favorite country up there. You can see that we identified some significant property landscape that would be covering a vast array of the distribution of the biodiversity in this particular hotspot. But this was not enough. This does not get to a decision matrix at all. It's way too many numbers. So then we continued to refine this, and this is where I want to emphasize how important it is to have the kind of collaboration across boundaries and to be speaking a consistent language of how you are collecting your information, analyzing it, and then ranking key biodiversity areas or particular species, because then what we did across these 7 countries is we whittled it down, and these were the recommendations that went up. I hope you can see that. Well, that probably doesn't come through very well. We took those 442 down with 29 important biodiversity corridors connecting them, and if any of you have worked in this area, you know how extraordinarily complex it is across the Andes, Amazon, and then to the coastal dry forests, et cetera, of this part of the world. We came up with 36 key biodiversity areas located in 7 corridors across 4 countries, and they're mapped there. In the green are the areas, the KBAs we call them, and then in the kind of, I don't know what color that is, kind of pinkish I guess for you, were the corridors. The point here I want to raise, and then I'll stop because I know we're moving along, is that this major funder asked us for recommendations. You cannot make recommendations, decision quality recommendations, unless you have a common language, unless you have a methodology that you do share, you have an understanding between the experts that you have, and I see several people in the room who've undertaken this kind of thing as well. And I just want to underscore that in this particular case, like in the previous one with the grassland, because we had that critical mass of people with that common language, we were decision quality data, we were able to produce the kind of analysis and recommendations that will lead to meaningful, sustainable conservation outcomes. And again, this is something that's very important. These are really difficult landscapes to work in for different reasons, but again, because we put together the right science with the right people at the right time, we're able to see, I think, an optimistic and bright future. So, thanks.
Yeah, you did.
All right, don't let me down.
Our next speaker today is Melanie McField with the Smithsonian Institute, and is founder and director of the Healthy Reefs for Healthy People initiative, which is a multi-institutional effort to track the health of the Mesoamerica's reef system. Through monitoring and evaluation, Melanie's work is ensuring the work is underway in Belize, Guatemala, Honduras, and Mexico, and that work is resulting in ecosystem restoration and integrity. Having been awarded Oceania's Belize's Ocean Champion Award in 2013, Melanie is truly a champion of ocean environments. Welcome, Melanie.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for sticking it out till Saturday evening. Okay, so I am the director of Healthy Reefs for Healthy People, and this is our workspace, the Mesoamerican Reef. It's the Northwestern Caribbean, including Mexico, Belize, Guatemala, Honduras. Amazing reef systems, coastal wetlands, and watersheds. From the beginning of this concept of the eco-regional work, we have included the land and thought about the land's impact on the sea. This is where the story begins for me. This Mesoamerican reef story began 10,000 years ago with sea level rise and the flooding of the shelf that allowed the reef to begin to grow. But for me, 1990 was the point when I began to have my relationship with the reef. I was a bright-eyed and very optimistic Peace Corps volunteer that went down to Belize and was put to work here in the Hol Chan Marine Reserve. This place is phenomenal. It's 1 square mile, so we're going to grow in our size of conservation. But right now we're starting with a 1 square mile piece of reef real estate, fully protected from fishing, and with an amazing abundance of fish. So other communities in Belize started coming to this park and saying, hey, we want a Hol Chan, and that's what they called it. Hol Chan means little channel in Mayan. So they recognized it was a small space, but it had amazing large benefits and a roll-on, spin-out effect. Within a few years, we began to have a full network of marine protected areas in Belize. And then that also, we began to think about coastal zone management and the whole impact that the reef was having on the economy. This is not a hard sell to people that live and breathe and work in Mesoamerica. They live in close contact with the reef. They know it's valuable. But in 2008, it was actually quantified by WRI, and that helps our case. It builds the background support for why you need reef conservation. One of the things that we began to see as the reef became more popular and tourism became more popular down in the region is a little more impacts. So we began to notice that, well, these impacts are actually larger scale than our rather small, mostly protected areas. Then in 1995, we experienced our very first coral bleaching event. So that was appalling and scary because we didn't actually know what was going on. I had a dial-up internet connection that I used to try to find out some information. And it was really amazing, how little we knew at that time, at least in Belize. No one had experienced it before. So we survived that one. We managed to pull a group together very quickly, went out and did assessments and found out that, only about, 40% of the reef had bleached, but very little died. We said, this is okay. Our reef is healthy. It's good. We're going on. 1998 comes. That was the worst bleaching event yet. And that resulted in a little more mortality, and also it was concurrent with a Category 5 hurricane. Our reef got beaten up. So now we're seriously worried and thinking, okay, it's going to come back because it's healthy. But is it healthy? How do we know? How do you measure that? And was there consensus, back to that idea of common voice? That was the birth of the Healthy Reefs Initiative. It was that simple question, how do you define a healthy reef? How do you measure it? And we spent 2 years developing a whole book that outlines and details the indicators of reef health and actually gives the metrics quantities. Like, this is what we would hope to achieve in a reasonable time period. Threshold values of what we consider good and poor. And those values we are able to use in this report card system. We've now done 4 of these report cards on the health of the Mesoamerican reef. Very easy to understand. They actually are targeted towards decision makers and general public. It's the same level, right? That's all I'm saying. So the same, that very easy to understand, breaking science down into categories and colors and doing maps, and we have actually graded it. That was a difficult accomplishment, I think, to get scientists on board to agree that we can grade the reef with categories. And that's based on, a lot of science, but in the end, it comes down to what you need to do. Scientists need to break it down for the managers and the policymakers. After we had done the second report card, we realized each of these report cards gives you the status of the reef at that point in time, but it also puts forth recommendations that were developed by the collaborative group that did the report card. The recommendations for, what can you do to improve reef health. So then we realized, well, we're going to keep making these recommendations, and we're not really evaluating whether that is being implemented. We're evaluating the reef, but we're not knowing which ones of those recommendations. So we developed something called the eco-audit. If you can see very much of that. The MAR overall has a score of 62 now. So it's 62% of the things that have been recommended, it's 62% to completion. So each one has like a five-point grading scale for how complete it is. You can be partially complete along that trajectory. Some things we're doing well, like research and monitoring. We like to do that. We're doing a good job at that. MPAs we're doing pretty well. Sewage and sanitation, for some reason, no one wants to touch it with a 10-foot pole. I don't know why, A few other, private sector is not doing as much as it should in the region, but since the economy is really based on the reef, it's very important. But this is the group of people that are working on it. So the conservation collaboration that Healthy Reefs has managed to pull together grew from the initial point of doing that book that kind of defined everything and got everyone with a common vision. It was 4 organizations. Now it's 66 organizations in the Mesoamerican Reef. All of the marine protected areas managers, which are often small NGOs, are the ones that are largely in that logo bank, plus the government departments that are in charge of managing reefs. So we've got all the key players together. We come together once a year for a meeting, and that's really important. We've had a lot of fun and gotten in the water and counted a lot of fish, 267,000. This is just from our database. The report cards are built on the database that Healthy Reefs maintains, and we have it open access to all the partners and others. But partners also contribute data, so we've actually counted more fish than that because we don't have all their totals in this. Next, I'm going to tell you about the actual conservation successes we've had. So through this partnership, we evaluate the successes, but the partners themselves are doing really great work, and our initiative is helping support that, and we are sharing the information to make these success stories roll out a little faster throughout the whole region. This success is in Belize, and the name of the organization is Fragments of Hope. So you can see that the idea of telling hopeful stories has really taken on, and they understand it and believe it. This little group has planted out fragments, little corals. This is Acropora cervicornis, an endangered species. So we're bringing back this endangered species from the brink. Over 90,000 just in the southern Belize region, 90,000 corals have been planted. This is over 10 years. And she's measured a 35% increase in coral cover in that area. So other groups in Mexico and Guatemala are also now doing coral nurseries and coral transplanting, and even doing sexual reproduction of corals in their labs and then transplanting them out. So we've got a real focus on restoration, and those groups are sharing information and helping bring back endangered corals. Through the process of developing the Healthy Reefs book, we stress the fact that both structure and function of the ecosystem need to be intact in order for you to call it healthy. So herbivory is one of the critical functions on a coral reef, and one of the functions that we think is the most in most decline right now due to overfishing. So these parrotfish had not traditionally been fished in the region, but as we fished down the food chain and took most of the snappers and groupers, these began to become a target. And so in the 2008, that was the first report card, we actually recommended, and scientists had recommended from the Coral Reef Symposium, we should protect parrotfish. And Belize actually did it in 2009, Guatemala did it in 2015, Honduras did it in 2010, in the whole Bay Islands, and we've now measured, and Mexico, we're working on it. We haven't given up. We're going to get it in the Mesoamerican region of Mexico. And we actually measure an increase in parrotfish biomass over this time through the monitoring. So that's a win. We haven't yet controlled our macroalgae, but we've got a lot of bites on the reef, so I think it will happen. The other thing we've been working on a lot is the marine protected areas. That was kind of back to the beginning of the story, but they've been increasing, and we've realized it's not just protection, you've got to actually do that no-take. So we have measured through the evaluation process more fish. So actually that more fish, and within the no-take zones of the marine reserves, we've got about 10 times the biomass. We also used our network 2 years ago when we got the predictions of this major coral bleaching event. Because we had everyone organized in the same space, we could quickly go out and assess for the coral bleaching, and we did that. And so we counted these, 34,000 corals over the 2 year periods during the bleaching season, and found out that our region was luckily not that severely affected by the coral bleaching. So, this can change from one event to the other, but the fact that we had the network ready for like an emergency response, we could get out there and quickly do it. We think that is one of the major successes. One of the other benefits of being out on the reef and doing these monitoring expeditions, and actually one of our reefs was discovered through a training expedition where they just went out into a new reef area, is beautiful new reefs that we didn't know exist and are not on the maps. So like the Millennium Coral Reef Ecosystem maps, they don't have any maps in Guatemala. This reef is in Honduras, and it's right by the airport. It's called Banco Cordelia. It's got the highest coral cover in the Caribbean. It's like 62% living coral cover, largely that endangered cervicornis, right by the port and the airport. There's the cruise ships coming in and out, and it's really odd. The other discovered reef in Honduras was off of Tela Bay. It's a deep reef, so you don't see it from the satellite images, and it's got almost 60% live coral cover of Agaricea. It's these phenomenal things, and I think it's the unknown. We don't know why these coral reefs are so good in these unusual locations, close to the mainland shore in this Tela Bay. The water is not even clear. Why are these corals doing so well? That's part of the fun, and I think the joy of nature is not knowing exactly, we don't have all the answers, and that helps us keep going, and it actually fuels optimism. But in the end, I think what we're really after is getting people hooked and getting them involved. This was no, I won't call it a stunt. This was an activity we did to get people out on the reef and get this wonderful photo before the COP10 that was in Cancun. So we sent this image to Cancun. We also did another one that was not optimistic. It was called The End. It said The End, and it had a question mark, like, will we see the end of coral reefs? But we felt no, so we did a nice, harmony, positive image on a beautiful reef, and it took the collection of all the people working together to spell this out and make this diagram. And we've been in the water collecting the data for 10 years now. We have an open access database. I invite you all to please like our Healthy Reefs for Healthy People Facebook site and follow us on social media. And we're really trying to roll this out now to the wider Caribbean. You know, we think we've had a number of other places have been interested in doing report cards, and it's just about a lot more than just the report cards. We need the data, we need the framework, the common vision, but getting everyone together is what's really given us the best benefit. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Melanie. Our next presenter is John Weller. John's a writer, a speaker, a photographer, and a filmmaker whose mission is to drive marine conservation around the world. In 2004, he and Antarctic ecologist David Ainley founded the Last Ocean Project, the first dedicated campaign for a marine protected area of the Ross Sea in Antarctica, and co-founded the Last Ocean Charitable Trust with New Zealand filmmaker Peter Young in 2007. In 2016, the Commission for Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, the Ross Sea Marine Protected Area, designated Ross Sea Protected Area as the first large-scale international marine protected area. John continues to work as a warrior in defense of the world's oceans and protected areas. John, welcome.
Well, hello everyone. Thank you so much. It's an absolute honor to be here, and I'm very excited to share this important story. So first I want to start off by showing you this photograph. I've been a photographer for 17 years, and I've taken nearly 2 million images, and this humble photograph is the most important image that I've ever collected. So I'm here to tell you the story of this photograph, and to do so, I actually have to take you to the Ross Sea. It's the southernmost body of water in the world. It's about 3,500 miles south of New Zealand, and to get there, unless you're going to take a C-130 and fly down to McMurdo, you have to get on a ship and cross the Southern Ocean. And I wish I could give you the power when each 30-foot swell lifts the ship and slams it down into the next wave, sending this angry curtain of salt white spray 50 feet into the air. Now, on the extremes of the worst rolls, you can actually walk on the walls as the ship navigates these vast silver-black mountains of water, until 5 days later, when the ocean calms to nearly glass and a thin white line separates the sea and sky. And that's the edge of the ice. When the ship cuts through that line, you're confronted, those towering waves are left behind, and you're confronted with this pavement, this jigsaw puzzle of floating ice that extends out to the edge of your imagination in all directions. And the only other topography down there at all are these floating mountains of blue ice that saw at the sky like jagged teeth. And it's the most humbling place I've ever been, but this is all just a backdrop, because the pack ice ecosystem is actually the richest ecosystem in the world if you measure in biomass. And most of that biomass is actually krill, so the minkies and the orcas navigate down through this sea of ice, finding the most improbably small breathing holes to take a breath of air and hunt this bounty. As you go deeper into the ice, Adelie penguins zoom past the edges, leaving these bridal veils of bubbles in the cerulean blue water. They explode out of the water and onto the ice and leave parts of their stories written in the snow. In the skies, snow petrels dart around like pieces of origami that are tossed to the wind. And I wish I had the time to go into each of these stories in detail, because these natural histories are fantastical. For instance, you probably know something about the emperor penguin and the males standing for months of Antarctic night, each with a single egg on their feet, protecting this precious package from the deadly cold. But you probably don't know much about their diving physiology, which is just as profound. So these are the deepest diving birds in the world. They get down to 600 meters with dive times of up to 25 minutes. And just before a dive, an emperor, you'll see them standing on the edge of the ice. They'll start flapping their wings. And what they're doing is raising their heart rate up to 250 beats a minute to hypersaturate their body with oxygen. When they hit the water, they go right back down to their resting heart rate of 60. And over the course of a long dive, they can slow their heart rate to just 6 beats a minute. And when they pop out of the water, they immediately return their heart rate up to 250 beats a minute to replace all that oxygen. And in doing so, they actually replicate the stresses of a human heart attack on each dive. And of course, that's just the view from above water. When you drop below the ice, shades of cyan replace the veils of white, and there in the blue light, the seals sing. Pretty cool. So wet-tail seals are the southernmost mammals in the world, and they live in the Ross Sea all year long. But to pull this off, they must, at times, dive half a mile deep, enduring the pressure of a car crusher, stay submerged for an hour and a half, and eat their way through the ice to keep their holes open in the dead of winter. So in each interaction, each encounter, I knew I was witnessing this masterpiece of evolution. Fish that make their own antifreeze, sea spiders the size of dinner plates. And each of these creatures is just supremely adapted to the unimaginable rigors of living in a sea of ice. So now that you know a little bit more about the Ross Sea, I want to back up and tell you about its importance in the context of the world's oceans and explain why I committed 12 years of my life to trying to tell this story. And it all started with this Antarctic researcher, David Ainley. Just to give you a sense of the man, he's published over 200 scientific articles, but none more important than these two in 2002 and 2004, where he first described the Ross Sea as the last large intact marine ecosystem left on the planet. And it was the second of these two papers that found its way to my desk. Now, at the time, I knew very little about oceans, actually embarrassingly little about oceans. And the idea that there could be just one last place left on the planet untouched was kind of, it blew me back. As did the rest of this paper, which describes the threat to this system, which is a deep water fishery for the poorly understood Antarctic toothfish. It's the largest predatory fish in the Southern Ocean, plays critical roles in the ecosystem, and of course it's sold, if you don't know, as Chilean sea bass around the world. Now the Ross Sea toothfish fishery is the southernmost fishery in the world. It's the most remote fishery in the world. And catch levels were ramping up without the very basic natural history information to ensure sustainability. Until last year, nobody had ever found an egg. Nobody has found a larval fish. Nobody knows where they breed. Nobody knows when they breed. Nobody knows how often they breed. Really, the only things we knew about this fish is that they live into their 50s and they start breeding when they're in their late teens, which marks them as a likely candidate for overfishing. So I couldn't get this story out of my head, and I eventually hunted David down at his house in California. And during that first meeting, we committed to each other to work together and make a stand and call for a marine protected area in the Ross Sea. But how to do that? Because any protection would have to run through CAMLR, the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, which is the international body responsible for managing the Southern Ocean, and where all decisions are actually unanimous. So we would have to convince 24 nations and the EU that this was a good idea. So how to do that? Well, to start with, CAMLR is exceptionally well designed to incorporate science into its resource management. So David created a flood of science, working with like-minded scientists to rigorously demonstrate the importance of the Ross Sea as a living laboratory and describe the effects of climate change on the system and identify potential ways in which the fishery could interfere with the system. But what was really missing from this whole thing was a meeting of the minds, a master paper that incorporated science from across disciplines and created the basis for forming a marine protected area. So that's what we did. We called that meeting of the minds in 2009, and it resulted in this paper, which became the basis for the design of the marine protected area. We used that paper to collect scientific consensus from over 500 scientists across the globe, and in 2010, the U.S. became the first national sponsor of the marine protected area. But that didn't stop the science, of course. The scientists reinvigorated, kept on publishing on climate, on ecosystem dynamics, and of course on the fishery itself, and basically put Camelar on notice that the world was watching. At the same time, we needed to bring this story to audiences across the globe. So early in this process, I came across a partner in New Zealand filmmaker Peter Young, and later in Cassandra Brooks, an Antarctic researcher. This woman would become my wife, and she is holding an Antarctic toothfish in this photograph. So you can probably guess where that conversation started. And together, we formed The Last Ocean. I wish I had time to pay homage to all of these people and organizations in these lists, because each of them contributed a critical support during some part of the project. But suffice to say, we had a lot of help. And by 2009, I had been down to the Ross Sea 4 times, 3 times on ships, 1 time as a guest at the National Science Foundation to dive under the ice for 3 months. Peter had joined me on one of those trips to the Ross Sea, and he had followed the path of the toothfish from hook to plate all across the world. And with 160,000 images and 250 hours of film, we went to tell this story to the public. We started publishing articles, and by the end of the project, the images had been published thousands of times in publications all across the world, reaching a global audience approaching 100 million. Peter took his film, toured the globe, winning awards. I published a book that was distributed to top diplomats, and we were invited to speak everywhere from elementary schools to actually addressing the Camelar delegates themselves. And of course, we developed partnerships with other organizations, each working in each of the Camelar countries. So what we did is we took this obscure place at the bottom of the world and we brought it into the mainstream. We gave it a face. We branded it. And by the end of the project, we had 1 million signatures supporting this initiative. The Ross Sea was actually known as the last ocean, even on the floor of Camelar, and we put Camelar on notice that the world was watching as well. So let's take a look at how that scientific pressure and this public pressure and eventually diplomatic pressure played out on the floor of Camelar. Well, actually, the UK gets the pole position here because they started talking about marine protected areas in 1996 in Camelar. Now, the U.S., when it took the Ross Sea initiative on, was quickly joined by New Zealand, and in sponsorship of the bill, and supported by Australia and Belgium. When it finally came to the floor in 2012, 9 more countries added their support, and the Ross Sea MPA looked like this. Now, over the course of the next 2 years, the MPA proposal was actually cut down by 40%, but in return, all but 2 countries were on board. And that takes us to the man who basically took the Ross Sea MPA initiative across the finish line. So in 2013, working with the Pew Charitable Trusts, we were able to gain the attention of Secretary of State John Kerry. And Kerry spoke about the Ross Sea, but more than that, he took it on as a personal cause. He wanted this to be part of his legacy. And in the lead up to the 2015 Camelar meeting, he brought the story to President Obama, who spoke directly with the Chinese president. And that's what brought China on board, but with one last negotiated concession, which was a krill research zone on the west of the Ross Sea. That left only Russia in opposition. And in 2016, Kerry was again working behind the scenes with Minister Lavrov, and they came to agreement just prior to the 2016 Camelar meeting. So let's get back to this photograph. This is a picture of Gillian Dempster. She is the head of the New Zealand delegation, and she's holding a signed map of the Ross Sea Marine Protected Area moments after adoption on October 28th, 2016. Despite considerable concessions to the fishery and a limited duration clause of 35 years, this is currently the largest marine protected area in the world and significantly the first large-scale international marine protected area. And I wish you could have been there on the floor of Camelar when this happened, and this room of stoic international diplomats erupted. And people were standing and laughing and cheering and crying. Nations were literally hugging other nations. And so I want you to understand that this wasn't just a massive win for Antarctica. This wasn't just a massive win for our global oceans, though it was both. This was a peace treaty. And finally, I want to say that I've been working on the Ross Sea MPA for 10 years before I really understood what was at stake. And that all became clear with the birth of my daughter. And so and what happened there, what happened in Kamilar, gives me hope that if enough of us speak up and commit ourselves to making a better world for our children, then that's just what we can achieve. And that's what we must do. Because when one story ends, others are just beginning. So, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I gotta wipe my tears. Okay, our next speaker is John Parker, who is a senior scientist and research ecologist at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center. John is living an adventurous life, and all in the name of research. So he says, anyway. He has lived in an undersea habitat, camped down in the African bush, ventured deep into the tiger habitats of the Sundarban mangroves, night diving with pods of dolphins, and swimming with alligators in the springs of Florida, although he didn't say if he was swimming with or from. All in the name of research. His research continues to focus on understanding the ecological and evolutionary impacts of climate change, biodiversity loss, and invasive species on native plant and animal communities here at home and across the entire world. Many of these projects include citizen scientists and volunteers working alongside professionally trained scientists and students, which is an important aspect, as we all know, in institutionalizing stewardship of our resources. Welcome, John.
And yet, I've never been to the Ross Sea. And I have no pictures of my kids to show. Oh, so already it's a downer. Does the laser pointer work? And am I the last talk, or is there one after me? One more after me. So.
It doesn't really, because you have to talk into the mic anyway.
Okay, great. All right, I tend to be a yeller and a walker, so if you people in the back can't hear me and I wander around, just let me know. Okay, great. So this is a great time. I'm really enthusiastic to be here. I love giving talks. Every time somebody asks me to give a talk, I almost always say yes. It's really important as a scientist to get out there and tell people about the good stuff that we're doing, right? And that's the whole point of Earth Day. It's the 47th Earth Day, the March for Science, obviously, and the Earth Optimism Summit, why we're all here. Now, given that, when they officially asked me to do this, I was a little bit hesitant at first. I mean, I'm a scientist. I'm used to thinking about all the things that are wrong with the Earth, right? There's almost no place on Earth that's untouched by man. We farm the desert, right? We farm the desert to get food to feed all the people that we have. Carbon dioxide concentrations are up 40%. 80% of fisheries are overexploited. These are all things probably everybody knows. Our iconic North American herbivore, the bison, the buffalo, is largely extirpated from most of its range. It's almost 100% decline since the 1800s. This is a huge pile of buffalo skulls waiting to be ground into fertilizer, of all things, right? I mean, how sad is that? So this is a map of global forest cover. This comes in a little bit where I'm going to talk about today. The green areas are existing forest cover. The red is deforestation since the colonial times. Most of the world was covered in forest. We wiped out a large portion of it. The little bit of white that you see at the end, that's reforestation. That's gain. And that's a little bit about what I'm going to be talking about today. So biodiversity is declining. What can we do about it? I'm a scientist. I'm also a citizen. What can we do about it from our little tiny patch of the woods? Well, what I'm going to talk about today is an experiment that we took under, we started about 4 years ago at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, which I'm going to show you in a second. It's all those fields that you can see right there. From an ecological perspective, this is a really large experiment. It's about 60 acres in size. It's about 20,000 trees. If you had to walk up to each and every tree to take a measurement, it's literally a marathon. So it's a big experiment. It's really tough to do. We designed it to last for 100 years because trees last a long time, right? They're long-lived. Now, I'm an academic, so I have to publish papers, get grants, train graduate students, and when I tell people that this is what I'm doing now, I'm taking on this large sort of demonstration project, this is the response that I often get, right? Why are you doing this? This is kind of a crazy endeavor. So what are you doing this for? And it is important to ask yourself, why do we need these large-scale, long-term biodiversity experiments? There are easier ways to reforest an area, right? This is a typical forest plantation. It's a monoculture. There's actually a lot of these around the world, about 300 million hectares, or 7% of the world's forest area. We're getting about 3 million new hectares of this kind of forest every single year because they're really important for industry. And basically about 5 different species, most of the world, comprise these single species monocultures. Now, I'm an ecologist, I'm a community ecologist, and so I think that variety is the spice of life, right? All this diversity here on the right-hand side of this panel, these multiple species assemblages, we know from lots of different experiments that when you have multiple species around, they take up resources more efficiently, they utilize things better, and that system as a whole functions a little bit better than that monoculture over on the left. The other thing that's going on there, like let's just say a pest comes along, wipes out one of the species, you've got a bunch left to take up the slack. So biodiversity is good. This is the prevailing sort of conventional wisdom. We know this from lots of different relatively small-scale experiments, things like lab beakers on a bench, mesocosm experiments, and I'm not just picking on all of these. This is an example from my own research over on the left in shallow water seagrass beds, but basically small-scale experiments. This is at a slightly larger scale. This is the Cedar Creek Biodiversity Experiments, very famous set of experiments in Minnesota. These are grassland ecosystem experiments. Each one of those is a 10 by 10 meter plot, I think the size is. And what they've done in there is they've manipulated grassland plant diversity, from 1 to up to 20 or 30 species and measured some ecosystem function. And almost always you see a positive relationship between diversity and ecosystem function. But as a newly converted sort of terrestrial ecologist working in forests, forests are kind of where it's at. It's about 80% of the world's terrestrial biodiversity is tied up in forest. This is a very famous terrestrial ecosystem, a long-term study site for the Smithsonian, Barrow, Colorado Island in Panama. And essentially what people have studied there for a long time is how that forest template scales up to influence both the tree diversity, productivity, and all the things that utilize that forest, all the little insects and critters that live in there. Now, I actually learned a couple of things putting together this talk that I wanted to share with you because I think it's really neat. So, there's been a recent count. There's about 3 trillion trees on the earth. That's an enormous number. Until you consider that we're losing 10 billion trees a year to deforestation, right? The second thing is, there's about 60,000 tree species on the earth. Again, a huge number. But 1 in 6 of every tree species is threatened with extinction. And for most of these species, the vast majority, we know virtually nothing about what they're doing in ecosystems. We know very little about their ecology and how that might scale up to influence the whole ecosystem in which they live. So we need these tree diversity experiments, but trees are big and they live a long time. And it's hard to do these kinds of experiments, and not many people have done them before. Now, from a philosophical perspective, that doesn't mean we shouldn't do them. This is an old saying I really like. The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now. So that's one way to think about this. If not now, when? Just go ahead and do it. But it doesn't solve sort of my practical problem as a scientist and how do you get papers and what's the rationale for doing these kinds of experiments. This is a little bit of a shout out for the Smithsonian here. I'm lucky enough to work at a great institution like this. We're well known as a set of museums on the mall. Right, we have lots of natural history collections, cultural artifacts. We do a lot, and they really sort of encourage a long-term, broad-scale perspective on the world around us. Now, what most people don't recognize, I was actually talking to someone earlier today about this, is we have a bunch of research centers around the world. And what I want to do now is orient you to where I work. It's only about 25 miles from here. Just the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center. So here we are in D.C., and we're zooming over the landscape. We're passing from an urban to a rural gradient. This is a 3,000-acre wooded campus on the shores of the Chesapeake Bay. That was a big research lab. There's my site. There's my field site right there. As we zoom in, you're actually going to be able to see my trees and the experiments there. So what we've done is we're taking a single watershed. There's all the little trees. Now we're passing down a little stream that cuts through the middle. It's an entire encapsulated watershed that's been studied continuously for 30 years. And that watershed dumps into the Road River, which itself dumps into the Chesapeake Bay. So one of the ways I like to think about this experiment, if we get nothing out of it, at the very least, we've taken this farming agricultural system, converted it back to a native forest, and helped out with the sort of the nutrient diet that the Chesapeake Bay needs. Okay, this is too big of an experiment to do by yourself. We've had lots of help doing this. I have a real public outreach component in my lab, which we were talking about earlier. I've used about 200 different citizen scientists, everything from families and homeschool people to graduate students have been out there to help us out. And in fact, one of the interns is here today. What are we measuring? So what are the different things that we're measuring out there? Well, the first thing is tree survival and growth. If trees don't survive and don't grow, you don't have a forest. So this is it when we planted it. This is 2013. Again, it was just a few years ago now. Those little tiny green things that you see in the middle spot there, those are sycamore trees. Everything that we planted was a 1-year-old bare root seedling when we planted it. Take a look at that. There's a tower. It's getting lost a little bit in the sunlight there in the background, but there's a little radio tower in the background that you might be able to see for reference on this next slide. Here those trees are in 2015. So I'm standing in that same spot. Those sycamore trees are now 30 feet tall. That actually little mini patch of sycamores is starting to act like a mini forest, which is what we're aiming for, right? This is a way of studying different species both in isolation and in combination. And off to the back of my left, you can see a little bit of green there. Those trees haven't really grown very much, but that's sort of the nature of the business. Different species do different things. Okay, this is a map showing what's happening over time with mortality. Each time you see a dot and it disappears, that tree died. I want you to focus on up in the top right there, that little blue patch that nothing changes. That's that sycamore plot I was standing in earlier. Only one of those trees died over the entire time we were there. But if you look a few patches over to the left, there's a little purple square where almost everything dies over time. That's one of our poorly performing hickory patches. That's sort of what happens. You have species-specific mortality. But I want to show you now the effects of the diversity level. So I was told not to show any graphs. Don't be such a scientist, but old habits die hard. So I will show one graph. This is sort of your homework to do this. Okay, on the left-hand side, this is the number of surviving trees after 3 years. We started at 255, so any decrease from that line is mortality. And it's either in the one species treatment, so you have 255 trees and they're all the same species, a 4-species mixture, or a 12-species mixture. Okay, look across those lines across the middle there. It's basically the same thing. We got about 78% survival across the whole experiment, which is actually not bad in terms of a tree restoration experiment, by the way. But it doesn't differ from 1 to 4 to 12, right? So biodiversity is not increasing the survival overall, which, okay, that's fine. But look at the variability. Those little black dots, those are the spread around the mean. So those are the individual plots. At the single species level, some do really well, and some basically don't. But that variability decreases as you go to 4, and it gets even smaller if you go up to 12. So in fact, there's 62% less variability in the 12 species versus the single species polyculture. This is the portfolio effect of biodiversity. This is analogous to buying a mutual fund versus a stock, right? You buy a mutual fund, your average performance is going to stay pretty high, but you minimize your risk of picking a really poorly performing stock, or species in this case, right? You may miss out on the best performing stock, but at least you don't have complete planting failure. So the point here in the bottom is that biodiversity is risk management. This is why we protect biodiversity in our ecosystems. So if you lose one species, there are others left around to pick up the slack. And this is experimental evidence from only 3 years in a tree experiment. Okay, we're measuring a bunch of different things. I'm going to run through these really quickly in the interest of time here. I have a postdoc. She's a Smithsonian fellow. She's sitting way in the back. Karen Burkhart. She's looking at insect diversity. This is important because the forest is more than just the trees, right? We're really interested in how this stuff scales up to influence everything that depends on the forest. Insects are really important because they form the base of the food web that goes up and it becomes mammals and birds and everything else. And what she's found after just 1 year is that if you look at a tree and you look at the insects on it in a polyculture versus a monoculture, you get 40% more insects and more diverse groups of insects in a mixture. So in this case, the effects of biodiversity do ripple up through the food web and have positive impacts on everything else. Okay, we're looking at a bunch of different things. One of the things you always have to worry about when you plant a forest, if you plant a tree or anything in your backyard or white-tailed deer, yes, they're native parts of the ecosystem, but they're wildly overabundant, and so we're interested in how different species respond to that. We're looking at lots of different below-ground stuff, below-ground carbon storage, nutrient dynamics, microbial activity. The idea here is that different species do different things, and when you combine them, you're going to get more functions in a multi-species assemblage than a single-species assemblage. We're part of a larger global network called TreeDivNet. It's about 25 experiments in 6 continents. The earliest one started, or the oldest one in 1999. So it's not very long in terms of a tree growth, but it's not bad. We've actually planted over 1 million trees in this effort so far, 230 different tree species. So we were pretty proud of that until we saw that India has recently planted 50 million trees in a single day. So everybody's getting into the tree planting business, including the Queen Mum. This is a really important effort to do. What I hope that we can do as scientists then is we can bring a little bit of scientific perspective to this. If the goal is to protect biodiversity, to minimize your risk, and to provide multiple ecosystem functions, we should really be planting these multi-species assemblages, not the single-species assemblage. And I want to leave you with one final slide here. This is sort of why I'm doing all of this. Yes, I planted an experiment that will probably outlive me, and that's basically a good thing because, first of all, it's just going to sit there, soaking up nutrients, soaking up carbon. Trees are a tried and true source of carbon capture technology. And at the end of the day, though, what we're really hoping to get here is provide science-based solutions for the grand challenges that we face. So thank you very much for coming, and keep it up. Yep.
Thank you so much. Our next and final speaker is Kerry Cesareo. Kerry is with the World Wildlife Fund. And during a summer working with First Nations on the Vancouver Island in British Columbia, Kerry's future and dedication to forest health was sealed. Kerry now serves as Vice President for Forests at World Wildlife Fund and leads the organization's goal to conserve the planet's most important forests. By using innovative financial models to ensure forest protected areas are properly managed, addressing illegal logging through law and policy, and the threats to forests from agricultural expansion and infrastructure development, Kerry is making a difference and a true model for conservationists. Welcome.
Well, good evening. I was going to say good afternoon, but it's good evening, everyone. And I thank you for sticking with us, and I'm happy to help bring us home. I'm excited to be here among my fellow optimists, especially on Earth Day. So, optimists, we believe we can dream big, think big, do big. But I want to challenge us to consider, are we thinking big enough? How big? Sometimes I think, despite our optimism, we doubt what's possible. We start small. We think, well, we can scale up. But sometimes we don't even have a really good plan for how we're going to scale up. And we often don't have the luxury of time to scale up to address the scale of threats that we're facing on Earth. So I want to challenge us to think big. I want to tell you a story about starting big. This is a story of starting with the Amazon. The story starts with the Amazon Region Protected Areas Program, or ARPA. So by protected areas, I'm talking about national parks, wildlife refuges, indigenous reserves, the full scope of conservation areas. Through ARPA, WWF worked with partners to permanently fund the conservation and sustainable use of 150 million acres of the Brazilian Amazon. That's big. 150 million acres. That's larger than 2 Californias. Elaine, I'm sorry, that's actually large. That's 3 times the size of the national park system in the US. So we're talking scale here. And the way that the big idea behind how ARPA was secured means that it's ARPA for life. So what was the big idea that made ARPA for life? So well, where was I going here? So the big idea, I want to share with you the story of the big idea, the results of that approach, and where we go from here. So like many types of innovation, we took an idea from one sector and applied it to another. Specifically, we took an idea from private finance. So if you think about large-scale infrastructure deals around the world, you wouldn't start to build a bridge unless you had all of the finance in place, all of the partners, all of the agreements in place to ensure that you could finish the job. So our idea was, what if you took this idea from transportation infrastructure, billions and trillion-dollar deals done all around the world, what if you took that idea and applied it to green infrastructure? Could you secure our green infrastructure kind of once and for all, for life? And this approach addresses a very real problem. So this approach, called Project Finance for Permanence, addresses a problem illustrated by the story of Segundo. Segundo is a dedicated park ranger who is tasked with patrolling a huge expanse of protected area. But there are days when he doesn't have even enough gas to put in his truck, let alone the equipment or the backup that he would need to protect himself against illegal loggers and poachers. If we think about this in context, in the global context, in developing countries, only about a third of the finance we need is in place to secure protected areas. We depend on protected areas to safeguard much of the world's biodiversity. And yet, when we inadequately finance or do it in a piecemeal way, these important protected areas, the consequences are dire. A recent study found that only a quarter of these protected areas were actually doing the job that they were set up to do. The rest were, in effect, what we call paper parks. On the flip side, we know that when we increase funding to protected areas, we see a related decline in threats, such as deforestation. Oops. The Amazon is one of the most threatened forests on the planet. If we don't do something fundamentally different to protect it, if we don't address this fundamental problem, we risk losing most of it within a few decades, a couple decades. And I don't want to have to explain to my kids, what was the Amazon. So how do we do things differently? So what was the idea, or how did we get ARPA off the ground? I'm going to highlight 3 aspects. The first is rigorous planning. So we spent 2 years doing the financial and the conservation planning to really understand what would be necessary to secure ARPA into the future. We looked at this top down, bottom up. The second aspect, and this is where I'll describe kind of the mechanism that got the deal done, is this idea of a single closing to mobilize all the resources. So the idea behind ARPA was a single deal that mobilizes all of the resources, all of the institutional commitments that you would need to permanently conserve and achieve this game-changing goal. So there was a comprehensive agreement among all the donors and partners that laid out conditions that needed to be met in order for the deal to close. These conditions were things like appropriate staffing levels, future funding commitments, policy changes that would be needed in order to sustainably manage the protected areas system. And the deal could not close unless those conditions were met and all the funding was in place. So each donor leveraged the other, and the risk was managed across all of those commitments. A particularly innovative aspect about this fund, because there are trust funds out there for protected areas, was that this was a transition fund or a sinking fund where the government assumed financial responsibility over time. So the way this works is that there are disbursement conditions around sustainable management and sustainable financing. And if those are not met, the funds do not flow. If orange stops, yellow stops. The final aspect I would highlight, and this may be obvious, but partners are essential. So the role that WWF played in all this was really as an innovator and convener. Without the political will of the government of Brazil, this deal couldn't have happened. So this goes back to a commitment made many years ago by President Cardozo and was carried through to the closing of the deal. So partners are essential. That doesn't necessarily, they're essential, but it doesn't always make it easy. So when I started working on these project finance deals, I was having a heart attack every week because I thought, oh my God, the deal's dead, the deal's dead. And it took my colleague and ARPA veteran, Meg Symington, to put this in context. She said, oh, we thought ARPA was dead plenty of times. But in 2014, after years of planning, designing, negotiating, the ARPA for Life deal closed. And it secured 15% of the Brazilian Amazon. The deal, the fund amount was $215 million that would be dispersed over a period of 25 years. So what do we get for ARPA for Life? Well, we did get improved management, we got reduced deforestation, but we got so much more than that.
É a casa de 30 milhões de pessoas.
30 million.
La maison.
135种嘅语言。
Et des centaines de milliers d'espèces.
Soutenez-moi. 嗱，Amy Hall 變 place pour me.
Our home.
แต่อดทนอด
By recycling the world's carbon dioxide into oxygen.
O Amazonas revitaliza o nosso planeta.
Pura Brahman.
The entire planet.
I pomaga ustabilizować klimat.
In Vancouver.
In Hannover, Deutschland.
Papua New Guinea.
In Argentina.
Yangon, Myanmar.
한국의 서울에서.
Ethiopiano.
В России, в Сибири.
Bogotá, Colômbia.
No Brasil.
La Amazonia.
Almost 20% of the world's river water flows here. El Amazonas.
Das Kernstück unseres fragilen, globalen Ökosystems.
The Amazon.
Donde nuestro planeta es alimentado.
Tarihi Amazon, tarihi nani?
Mero Katha.
C'est mon histoire.
Is our story.
De ваша história.
E hoje a Amazônia precisa da nossa ajuda.
Y la ayuda ha llegado.
So that's it. So help has arrived. Now, you may be wondering if you've heard anything about Brazil lately. It's in political and financial turmoil. So the question is ARPA holding? We're at the Optimist Summit. I would say we are cautiously optimistic. This will really test the model and you know, how it holds. But I will say that regardless, safe to say that we are in a much better place than we would have been without ARPA for Life. As the Amazon knows no political boundaries, we're now replicating this model in Peru and Colombia. But we're not satisfied with looking at just the Amazon. So we are also working in Asia now. We have a deal in Bhutan. And it was the Bhutanese prime minister who was traveling the globe touting this initiative that introduced this idea of it's not just Amazon or ARPA for Life, it's not just Bhutan for life, we need Earth for life. So this is what we're trying to do now. So we want to learn from the ARPA example. We want to look at other project finance deals that have been done in Costa Rica, Great Bear Rainforest in Canada, and we want to scale this up. We're thinking, what if we could do this in 10 countries over the next 10 years? We need a platform of partners. We need more partners. We need a lot more money. But we think if we work together, we could leverage up to over $1 billion to apply this model in the places where it can have the biggest impact. And so I ask us all to continue to think big. In the Amazon, it's imperative. But we also know from ARPA for Life that it's possible. So not just dream, but do. And think about what's your Amazon in the places you work. We've already heard some really great ones. So I encourage everyone to not just dream, not just think, do big. And the key is that we need to do it together. Thanks.
So thank you so much. We have time for maybe one question. Are there any questions? If not, we'll also have the speakers up here where you can interact with them for a couple minutes after. But go ahead, please get up to the mic. And direct who your question is to, please.
Okay. This is for Mr. Miller. So you talked about restoring some grasslands in addition to conserving it. How does that go about? How do you have the amount of seeds to do that, or do you let nature reseed the landscape? for you? Like, how do you convert it from farmland to the original grassland?
Well, it's a whole other,
Yeah, you want to come up here just so we get it
it's a
recorded?
whole other set of strategies, I think. It's not simple, and that's not something that NatureServe ourselves can do, though we're working with several agricultural companies and seed companies are very involved in this, and several of the people who have spoken and many of the people in the room are quite involved. It's not leaving things fallow to just come back the way they are. They won't. But their active restoration is absolutely undergoing, and several organizations are working on that. What I had presented was a really more detailed map of how to get there.
Thank you. So I think if you do want to interact with the speakers for a few minutes after, that will be great because we do have to cut it. But I just want to say, if you didn't well up a tear or two during this session, something's terribly wrong with you. Because this was inspiring. I mean, these are models. I mean, let's face it, you have 12 minutes of some stories that are, like I said, inspiring, breathtaking. But these are years and years of people's lives dedicated to this work, just like many of you out there in the audience today. So let's give everybody a big round of applause.